Hi, I'm Marcus. Christmas Eve at my family's house was supposed to be magical. Instead, my stepmother Linda served me a plate of leftovers while everyone else got prime rib, then told me I could eat in the kitchen because there wasn't enough room at the table. When my own father laughed and said I should be grateful for scraps, something inside me broke. That's when I smiled and pulled out the deed to their house. The one I'd secretly bought 3 months earlier when they defaulted on their mortgage. Their faces went white as snow, and that was just the beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The December rain drummed against the windshield as I pulled into the circular driveway of what used to be my childhood home. The colonial-style house looked exactly the same as it had 15 years ago, cream-colored siding with forest green shutters, the wraparound porch decorated with garland and twinkling lights. Everything picture-perfect, like a Christmas card you'd find at Hallmark. But I knew better than anyone that pretty facades often hide ugly truths. I sat in my Honda Accord for a moment, watching through the bay window as silhouettes moved around inside. The warm glow made it look inviting, homey even. My stomach churned, but not from hunger. It was that familiar knot I'd carried since I was 12 years old, the day my father married Linda Patterson and everything changed. My phone buzzed, a text from my younger sister Emma. Please don't start anything tonight, I just want one normal Christmas. I stared at the message, typed and deleted 3 different responses, then finally just sent back a thumbs up emoji. Emma meant well, but she'd never understood what it was like to be the outsider looking in. She was Linda's biological daughter, the golden child who could do no wrong. I was just the baggage that came with marrying my dad. The front door opened before I even made it to the porch steps. Linda appeared in the doorway wearing a red cashmere sweater and perfectly pressed slacks, her blonde hair styled in soft waves that probably cost more than most people's rent. She'd always been beautiful in that polished suburban way that made other mothers feel inadequate at school pickup. "Marcus," she said, her smile tight and practiced, "you're late." "Traffic was heavy coming from the city," I replied, though we both knew I'd been sitting in the driveway for 10 minutes working up the courage to walk inside. She stepped aside to let me in, her perfume hitting me like a wall. The same floral scent she'd worn for 23 years, the one that used to make me nauseous as a kid whenever she'd lean over to critique my homework, or remind me to clean my room. The foyer was decorated like something out of a magazine, garland draped along the banister, a massive wreath hanging on the interior wall, and one of those fancy Christmas trees that looked like it belonged in a department store window. "Everyone's in the living room," Linda said, already walking away from me. "Dinner will be ready in an hour." The living room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Emma sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, playing with her 2-year-old daughter Sophia while her husband Jake lounged on the leather sofa, beer in hand. My father occupied his usual spot in the recliner, reading glasses perched on his nose as he scrolled through something on his tablet. He looked older than his 61 years, his brown hair completely gray, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. "There he is," Dad said without looking up from his screen. "The city slicker finally graces us with his presence." "Good to see you too, Dad." I kept my voice level, though the barb stung more than it should have. 23 years of marriage to Linda had changed him, made him sharper around the edges, quicker to criticize than to embrace. Emma jumped up and wrapped me in a hug, her dark hair smelling like vanilla shampoo. At 28, she was 5 years younger than me, but had already achieved everything Linda considered important: marriage to a successful accountant, a beautiful daughter, and a 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. The golden path I'd never managed to walk. "I'm so glad you came," she whispered in my ear. "It wouldn't be Christmas without you." Jake nodded at me from the couch. "How's the restaurant business treating you?" "Can't complain," I said, settling into the only available spot, a hardback chair that had been moved from the dining room. Funny how there was never quite enough comfortable seating when I visited. We had our busiest quarter yet. It wasn't technically a lie. I did work in the restaurant business, though probably not in the way they imagined. After culinary school, I'd spent years working my way up from prep cook to sous chef to head chef at some of the most respected establishments in the city. But 3 years ago, I'd taken a leap and opened my own place, a small Italian bistro called Nana's Table. What they didn't know was that the restaurant had become successful enough to expand into catering, which led to real estate investments, which led to me having a very different kind of financial situation than they assumed. Linda returned from the kitchen carrying a tray of appetizers, setting it on the coffee table with a flourish. Stuffed mushrooms, bacon-wrapped scallops, and some kind of fancy cheese spread that probably cost more than most people's grocery budget. She settled onto the couch next to Jake, smoothing her sweater with manicured hands. "Marcus, help yourself," she said, gesturing toward the tray. "Though maybe go easy on the cheese, you've been looking a little heavy lately." The comment hit like a slap, casual and cruel in the way only Linda could manage. I was 6'2" and weighed 170, hardly what anyone would call overweight, but she had a talent for finding the smallest insecurities and prodding them like fresh bruises. "I think I'll survive," I said, reaching for a scallop. Emma shot her mother a warning look, but Linda was already moving on, asking Jake about his latest golf game. The conversation flowed around me like I was a piece of furniture, occasionally acknowledged but never truly included. It was the same dynamic that had played out at every family gathering for the past 2 decades. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from my business partner Tony, "Final walkthrough tomorrow at 2 p.m. Everything's ready to sign." I smiled to myself, sliding the phone back into my pocket. If only they knew what I'd been preparing for the past 3 months. "What's got you grinning?" Dad asked, finally looking up from his tablet. "Just work stuff," I said. "You know how it is during the holidays." Linda snorted softly. "I'm sure your little restaurant keeps you busy." Little restaurant, the words hung in the air like smoke. She'd been diminishing my accomplishments for so long that it had become second nature, a reflex as automatic as breathing. When I'd graduated culinary school with honors, she'd wondered why I hadn't chosen a more practical career. When I'd been featured in a local food magazine, she'd pointed out that it was just a small publication. When I'd told them I was opening my own place, she'd asked if I was sure I could handle this responsibility. The thing was, I understood why she did it. Linda Patterson had grown up poor in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of a factory worker and a seamstress. She'd clawed her way up through sheer determination, working her way through college as a waitress, earning her business degree, and eventually landing a job at a marketing firm where she'd met her first husband. When that marriage fell apart, she'd been left with Emma and a mountain of debt. Then she'd met my father at a charity fundraiser, a successful architect with a good income and a son who needed a mother figure. It must have seemed like the perfect solution. Dad got help raising me, and Linda got the financial security she'd always craved. The problem was, I'd never been part of the plan. I was just an obligation that came with the package. "Dinner's ready," Linda announced, rising from the couch with practiced grace. The dining room table was set like something out of a home decorating magazine. Fine china, crystal wine glasses, cloth napkins folded into perfect triangles. The centerpiece was an elaborate arrangement of red and gold flowers that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. Linda had always been big on appearances, making sure everything looked perfect for the outside world to see. Dad carved the prime rib while Linda bustled around, filling wine glasses and making sure everyone had what they needed. Everyone except me, apparently. While the others received generous portions of perfectly seasoned beef, roasted vegetables, and garlic mashed potatoes, Linda set a plate in front of me containing what looked suspiciously like leftovers from yesterday's dinner. I stared at the plate. Cold turkey, congealed gravy, and what appeared to be day-old stuffing that had been hastily reheated. The kind of meal you'd scrape together from whatever was left in the refrigerator. "Sorry," Linda said without sounding sorry at all. "I must have miscounted when I was shopping. There wasn't quite enough prime rib to go around." Emma looked mortified. "Mom, I can share mine with Martin." "Don't be ridiculous," Linda waved her off. "He should be grateful for whatever. Not everyone can afford to be picky." The comment hit like a punch to the gut. Here I was, a successful restaurant owner who probably made more in a month than Dad did in 3, being served leftovers while everyone else enjoyed a feast. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the way Dad chuckled and nodded like Linda had made a perfectly reasonable point. "She's right, son," he said, cutting into his prime rib. "You should appreciate what you have instead of always expecting more. Always expecting more, as if wanting to be treated like an equal member of the family was somehow unreasonable, as if asking for basic respect was asking too much." Jake cleared his throat uncomfortably. "You know what, Marcus can have some of mine. I'm trying to watch my cholesterol anyway." That won't be necessary, Linda said firmly. Marcus is a grown man. He can handle eating what's put in front of him. I picked up my fork and took a bite of the cold turkey. It tasted like sawdust and defeat. Around the table, conversation resumed as if nothing had happened. Emma asked about Dad's latest project. Jake talked about Sophia's recent doctor visit. Linda shared gossip about their neighbors. I might as well have been invisible. This was my family, the people who were supposed to love and support me no matter what. Instead, I was the outsider who got leftovers while everyone else feasted, the afterthought who had to be grateful for scraps. But as I sat there choking down cold turkey, I couldn't help but smile. They had no idea what was coming. No clue that their perfect little world was built on a foundation that was already crumbling. 3 months ago, I'd been having lunch with my accountant when he'd mentioned something. The Patterson family home, the house where I'd grown up, was in foreclosure. Dad and Linda had apparently been struggling with the mortgage payments for months, taking out second and third mortgages to maintain their lifestyle. The bank was finally calling in their debts. At first I'd felt a surge of vindication. All those years of Linda's comments about my financial situation, her snide remarks about my little restaurant, and it turned out she and Dad were drowning in debt. But then I'd had a different thought entirely. I'd asked my accountant to look into the foreclosure proceedings. The house was scheduled to go to auction in 60 days. The starting bid would be whatever was owed on the mortgages, roughly $400,000. For a house currently valued at $600,000, it was actually a decent investment opportunity. But more than that, it was an opportunity for something else entirely. I'd spent 2 weeks thinking about it, weighing the pros and cons, considering the implications. Then I'd made some phone calls, arranged financing, and put together a plan that would have made Linda proud if she'd known about it. It was strategic, methodical, and absolutely ruthless. The auction had been held on a rainy Thursday morning in November. There were only 3 bidders, a local real estate developer, an investor from out of state, and me. The developer dropped out at $450. The investor kept bidding until $520, then shook his head and walked away. I'd won the auction for $525,000. The house where I'd grown up, where I'd been made to feel like an unwelcome guest for 23 years, now belonged to me. The deed was in my name, filed with the county recorder's office, completely legal and binding. Dad and Linda had 30 days to vacate. They still didn't know. The bank had been discreet about the foreclosure, and I'd asked my lawyer to handle all the paperwork through a shell company. As far as Dad and Linda knew, some faceless corporation had bought their house and would probably flip it or rent it out to strangers. They'd been scrambling to find a new place, downsizing their lifestyle, probably wondering how they were going to break the news to their friends that they'd lost the house they'd been so proud of. "Earth to Marcus," Emma said, snapping me out of my thoughts. "You okay? You've been staring at your plate for like 5 minutes." "Just thinking," I said, taking another bite of cold turkey. "About what?" Linda asked, though her tone suggested she didn't really care. "Work stuff," I said. "Big changes coming in the new year." Dad looked up with mild interest. "Finally going to get a real job." The comment was meant to sting, and it did, but not in the way he intended. Instead of the familiar hurt, I felt something else, anticipation. Because in about an hour, when dinner was over, and we'd moved on to dessert and coffee, I was going to show them exactly what kind of real job I had. Linda began clearing the dinner plates, pointedly, leaving mine, even though I'd only eaten about half the cold turkey. "I hope everyone saved room for dessert," she said. I made my famous tiramisu, her famous tiramisu, as if making a dessert somehow qualified as fame. But Linda had always been good at inflating her accomplishments, turning small achievements into grand successes. It was a skill I'd learned to recognize over the years, the way she could spin a community college business class into studying at university, or a part-time job at a marketing firm, into building her career in advertising. Emma helped clear the table, while Jake entertained Sophia with her new Christmas toys. Dad retreated to his recliner, probably to check it or read the news. The same routine we'd followed at every family gathering for as long as I could remember. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but instead of heading upstairs, I slipped into Dad's home office. The room was exactly as I remembered it, dark wood furniture and architectural drawings covering the walls. His desk was cluttered with bills and papers, more evidence of the financial stress he'd been trying to hide. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photos until I found what I was looking for, a picture of the deed to the house, taken the day after the auction. My name clearly visible as the new owner. I'd been carrying it around for weeks, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. Tonight was that moment. When I returned to the living room, Linda was serving her tiramisu in small crystal bowls, making a big show of presenting each portion like she was running a five-star restaurant. The irony wasn't lost on me, considering I actually did run a restaurant that had earned rave reviews from food critics across the city. "This looks amazing, Mom," Emma said, taking a bite. "You should open your own bakery." Linda preened at the compliment. "I've actually been thinking about that. Maybe something small and elegant for people who appreciate quality." People who appreciate quality, unlike her stepson apparently, who was still picking at his plate of reheated leftovers. I pulled out my phone, pretending to check messages. "You know, speaking of real estate," I said casually, "I heard this house was in foreclosure." The room went dead silent. Linda's spoon clinked against her bowl as she set it down. Dad's face went pale, then red, then pale again. "Where did you hear that?" Linda asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Word gets around," I said, still looking at my phone. "Small world, the restaurant business. I know a lot of people in different industries." Emma looked confused. "What does that mean?" "Foreclosure." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As an accountant, he obviously knew exactly what it meant, and probably had a good idea of how bad the situation was. "It means," I said, looking up from my phone, "that the bank took the house because the mortgage payments weren't being made. And then they sold it at auction to recover their losses." Linda's mask of composure was starting to crack. "That's a very simplified explanation of a complex situation." "You're right," I agreed. "The reality is usually much more complicated, especially when people have been living beyond their means for years, taking out multiple mortgages to fund a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford." Dad finally found his voice. "How do you know so much about our business?" "Because," I said, setting down my phone and reaching into my jacket pocket, "I made it my business." I pulled out a folded piece of paper and set it on the coffee table. The deed to the house, with my name clearly visible as the new owner. Linda stared at the document like it was a snake that might bite her. "What is this?" "It's the deed to this house," I said calmly. "As of November 15th, I'm the legal owner of 247 Maple Street, Millbrook, New York." Emma gasped. Jake's tiramisu slipped off his spoon and back into the bowl. Dad looked like he was having trouble breathing. "That's impossible," Linda whispered. "Is it?" I asked. "I attended the foreclosure auction. I placed the winning bid. I signed the papers and paid the full amount. The deed is registered with the county, it's all completely legal." Linda's face had gone white, then red, then back to white. "You did this on purpose, you knew we were struggling, and you deliberately." "I deliberately." "What?" I interrupted. "Bought a house that was for sale, participated in a legal auction, made a sound real estate investment." "You sabotaged us," Dad said, his voice shaking with rage. "Your own family." "My family?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The same family that just served me leftovers while everyone else got prime rib. The same family that spent 23 years treating me like an unwelcome houseguest." Emma was crying now, though I wasn't sure if it was from shock or understanding. Jake had his arm around her shoulders, probably trying to process the legal and financial implications of what I'd just revealed. "You can't do this," Linda said, standing up. "We'll fight it. We'll hire lawyers. Will Hugh?" "What?" I asked. "Sue me for buying your house at a public auction. Take me to court for making the highest bid." "I hate to break it to you, Linda, but there's nothing to fight. Everything I did was completely above board." She started pacing back and forth, her perfect composure completely shattered. "This is crazy. This is insane. You can't just buy someone's house out from under them." "Actually," Jake said quietly, "he can. If the house was in foreclosure and went to auction, anyone could bid on it. It's perfectly legal." Linda whirled on him. "Whose side are you on?" "I'm not on anyone's side," Jake said. "I'm just explaining how foreclosure auctions work." Dad was staring at the deed like it might spontaneously combust. "How much did you pay?" $525,000, I said. "About 100,000 less than the current market value." Like I said, it was a good investment. That's our home, Linda said, her voice breaking. We raised our children here. We have memories here. You can't just take that away from us. The way you tried to take away my sense of belonging here. I asked. The way you spent 23 years making sure I knew I wasn't really part of this family. Emma wiped her eyes with a tissue. Marcus, I know Mom hasn't always been. Hasn't always been what? I asked. Fair, kind, decent? Your mother has spent more than 2 decades making sure I knew I was second class in my own family. Well, now she knows how it feels to be powerless. Linda stopped pacing and turned to face me. What do you want? Want? You didn't do this just to hurt us, she said. You want something. Money? An apology? What? I pretended to think about it, though I'd known my answer for months. I want you to understand what it feels like to be disposable, to be treated like you don't matter, to have the people who are supposed to love you act like you're nothing more than an inconvenience. We never, Dad started to say. Never what? Never made me feel unwelcome, never treated me like a burden. Dad, you literally just laughed when Linda served me leftovers while everyone else got prime rib. He had the grace to look ashamed, but it was too little too late. Linda sat back down heavily, her face in her hands. So what happens now? Do we have to move out immediately? Where are we supposed to go? I pulled out my phone and showed her another document. According to the foreclosure timeline, you have until January 15th to vacate the premises. That's 3 weeks from today. 3 weeks, Emma gasped. That's not enough time to find a new place. It's the same amount of time any tenant gets when a property changes hands, I said. I'm not being unreasonable. Unreasonable? Linda laughed bitterly. You bought our house out from under us, and you think you're being reasonable. I think I'm being fair, I said. Which is more than I can say for how this family has treated me for the past 23 years. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Emma was still crying softly. Jake looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Dad stared at his hands like they held the answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. Finally, Linda looked up at me with something that might have been respect, if it hadn't been mixed with so much hatred. You planned this whole thing, didn't you? Coming here tonight, letting us serve you leftovers pretending like nothing had changed. You wanted to humiliate us. I wanted you to feel what I felt, I said. Every Christmas, every birthday, every family gathering where I was made to feel like I didn't belong. You want to talk about humiliation? Try being treated like a stranger in your own family for 23 years. Linda's mask slipped completely then, revealing the rage underneath. You were never our family. You were David's responsibility, not mine. I tried to be kind to you, but you were always so resentful, so angry about everything. I was angry because my father married a woman who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to her perfect life. I shot back. A woman who spent 2 decades making sure I knew I wasn't wanted. That's enough, Dad said. Stand. Both of you. Is it enough? I asked. Because I'm just getting started. You want to know what I've been doing while you've been busy treating me like garbage. I've been building something. I own 3 restaurants now, not just one. I have a catering company that services some of the biggest events in the city. I own rental properties in 4 different states. I'm worth more money than you'll see in your entire lifetime. Linda's mouth fell open. That's impossible. Is it? While you were busy diminishing my accomplishments and making jokes about my little restaurant, I was busy turning that little restaurant into an... While you were taking out 2nd and 3rd mortgages to maintain your lifestyle, I was investing every penny I made back into my business. I pulled out my phone and showed them a screenshot of my bank balance. I'd prepared it earlier, but knowing this moment would come. The number on the screen made Emma gasp and Jake whistle low under his breath. That can't be real, Linda whispered. It's very real, I said. Turns out that when you stop worrying about impressing people who don't respect you anyway, you can focus on building something meaningful, something lasting. Dad sank back into his chair like he'd been deflated. Why didn't you ever tell us? When? I asked. Between the jokes about my career choices, or maybe during one of the many conversations where Linda made it clear that nothing I did would ever be good enough. Emma wiped her eyes again. Marcus, I'm so sorry. I never knew it was this bad. Of course you didn't know, I said not unkindly. You were the golden child. You could do no wrong. But I spent 23 years being told that I was the problem, that I was ungrateful, that I should be happy with whatever scraps I was thrown. Linda was staring at her hands, probably trying to process everything that had just happened. Her perfect Christmas dinner had turned into a nightmare, and the stepson she'd dismissed as a failure had just revealed himself to be more successful than she'd ever imagined. So what now? Jake asked. What are you going to do with the house? I'd been waiting for that question. I haven't decided yet. I might renovate it and flip it, or maybe turn it into a rental property. The location is good, and the bones of the house are solid. You could sell it back to us, Linda said desperately. We could work out a payment plan or, with what money? I asked. You just lost your house to foreclosure. Your credit is ruined. What bank is going to give you a mortgage? She didn't have an answer to that because we both knew there wasn't one. Besides, I continued, why would I want to help people who have spent 23 years making it clear that I'm not really part of their family? Because we're still family, Emma said quietly. Blood is blood, is it? I asked. Because Linda just finished telling me that I was never really family, that I was just Dad's responsibility, not hers. Emma looked at her mother with disappointment. You said that. Linda's face crumpled. I was angry. I didn't mean you meant every word, I said. Just like you meant every snide comment, every put-down, every time you made sure I knew I wasn't welcome. The only difference is that now you're facing consequences for how you've treated me. I stood up and straightened my jacket. I should probably go. Thank you for dinner. The leftovers were delicious. The sarcasm hung in the air like smoke. Emma started to say something, but I was already walking toward the door. Marcus, wait, Dad called after me. I turned back to look at him. What? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. What could he possibly say? That he was sorry, that he'd been wrong to let Linda treat me the way she had, that he regretted choosing her over his own son year after year. It was too late for apologies. I'll be in touch about the move-out date, I said. My lawyer will send you the official paperwork. I walked out into the December night, leaving behind the warm glow of the Christmas lights and the sound of my family falling apart. For the first time in 23 years I felt like I could breathe freely in that house, because now it was my house, and they were the ones who didn't belong. The drive back to the city took 2 hours through sleet and holiday traffic, but I barely noticed. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I replayed every moment of the evening, every shocked expression, every stammered excuse. 23 years of built-up resentment had finally found its release and the satisfaction felt intoxicating. But as the adrenaline wore off and the city lights came into view, a different feeling began to creep in. Not regret exactly, but something more complex. I'd spent months planning this moment, imagining how it would feel to finally have power over the people who'd made me feel powerless for so long. The reality was messier than I'd anticipated. My phone buzzed with texts as I pulled into the parking garage beneath my downtown apartment building. 14 missed calls from Emma, 6 from Jake, and surprisingly 3 from Dad. I ignored them all and headed upstairs to the 32nd floor penthouse I'd called home for the past 2 years. The apartment was everything Linda's house pretended to be. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, modern furniture that actually looked lived in rather than staged, and a kitchen that would make any chef jealous. I'd designed it myself after my restaurant empire started turning serious profit, making sure every detail reflected who I'd become rather than who others expected me to be. I poured myself 3 fingers of 18-year-old Macallan and stood at the window, watching traffic move like blood cells through the arteries of the city. Somewhere out there, Linda was probably calling everyone she knew, trying to figure out how her worthless stepson had managed to buy her house. Dad was likely staring at the deed I'd left on the coffee table, trying to process how badly he'd misjudged his own son. And Emma was probably crying, caught between loyalty to her mother and the dawning realization of how cruel that loyalty had been. The whiskey burned, but not as much as the memory of Linda's face when she'd seen my bank balance. All those years of condescension, all those jokes about my little restaurant, and it turned out I was worth more than their entire suburban fantasy. The irony tasted sweeter than the scotch. My phone rang again, Emma for the 15th time. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me Marcus, her voice was thick with tears. Please don't hang up. I'm here. We need to talk, all of us. This can't be how it ends. I took another sip of whiskey. How what ends? The years of being treated like garbage, because from where I'm sitting this is exactly how it should end. That's not fair and you know it. Yes, Mom was wrong. She was cruel and I should have stood up to her more, but destroying the family isn't going to fix anything. I didn't destroy anything, I said. I just revealed what was already broken. There was a long pause. In the background I could hear muffled voices, probably Jake trying to calm things down while Linda had what sounded like a complete meltdown. "She's in the bathroom throwing up," Emma said quietly. "The stress is killing her. And Dad hasn't said a word since you left. He's just sitting there staring at that deed." Part of me felt a flicker of something that might have been guilt, but I pushed it down. Where was their concern for my well-being during all those years of subtle and not so subtle abuse? Where was Emma's outrage when her mother was serving me leftovers like I was some kind of charity case? "Emma, do you remember my high school graduation?" I asked. "What? My graduation? Valedictorian, full scholarship to culinary school, the whole thing. Do you remember what Linda said to me afterward?" Silence. She said maybe now I'd learn a practical skill instead of wasting my time on hobbies. She said cooking was fine as a fallback, but I shouldn't get my hopes up about making a career out of it. "Marcus, do you remember when I won the James Beard Award nomination for Rising Chef, first nomination in my restaurants category? I called to tell you guys, and Linda asked if it came with any money because awards don't pay rent." She was trying to be practical, she was trying to keep me small. I interrupted. Every success, every achievement, every time I tried to show that I was worth something, she found a way to diminish it, and Dad just let her do it. Emma was crying harder now. I know she was wrong. "But buying our house, Marcus, that's not justice, that's revenge. Maybe revenge is exactly what this situation needed." I hung up before she could respond, but the conversation had stirred up memories I'd spent years trying to bury. The whiskey wasn't helping anymore, so I set the glass aside and walked to my home office. The room was lined with awards, framed reviews and photographs from restaurant openings, evidence of a success story that Linda had never bothered to acknowledge. But tucked away in the bottom drawer of my desk was something else entirely, a manila folder labeled family that I hadn't opened in years. Inside were all the attempts I'd made to bridge the gap, copies of letters I'd written but never sent, printed emails that had gone unanswered, photographs from family events where I looked increasingly isolated as the years went on. There was even a Father's Day card from when I was 16 where I'd written a long message about how grateful I was to have Dad in my life. I'd found it in his desk drawer months later, never opened. The last item in the folder was a letter I'd written to Linda on her birthday about 5 years ago. I'd been feeling generous, thinking maybe we could find some common ground as adults. I'd written about how I understood she'd been protecting her own daughter, how I didn't blame her for putting Emma first, but maybe we could find a way to coexist peacefully. I'd even included a gift certificate to her favorite spa. She'd never responded, not even a thank you. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. This wasn't just about tonight's humiliation with the leftovers, though that had been the final straw. This was about decades of systematic exclusion, of being made to feel like an intruder in my own family. Tonight had just been the culmination of a pattern that had been building since I was 12 years old. The next morning brought a winter storm that blanketed the city in 8 inches of fresh snow. I'd planned to spend the day at the restaurant, but the weather kept most of the staff home, so I ended up cooking for the handful of customers brave enough to venture out. There was something therapeutic about the familiar rhythm of chopping vegetables and tending sauces, the kind of meditative focus that had always helped me think through complicated problems. Around noon, Tony Castellano pushed through the front door shaking snow off his coat. My business partner was built like a linebacker, but had the soul of an artist, the kind of guy who could intimidate suppliers into better prices one minute and write poetry about the perfect risotto the next. "Thought I'd find you here," he said, settling onto a stool at the kitchen counter. "Heard you had an interesting Christmas." Word traveled fast in our circle. Tony's wife Maria was Emma's college roommate, which meant the story of last night's dinner had probably made it through half the city's restaurant community by morning. "Interesting is one way to put it," I said, stirring a pot of butternut squash soup. "Maria called this morning, said Emma was beside herself, crying about how you bought their parents' house or something." He paused. "Please tell me that's not actually true." I ladled soup into a bowl and set it in front of him, along with a piece of homemade focaccia. "It's true." Tony stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Jesus, Marcus, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking that I'm tired of being treated like garbage by people who are supposed to love me, so you decided to destroy them financially." I decided to level the playing field. I wiped down the counter with more force than necessary. "They were already losing the house, Tony. The bank was foreclosing whether I bought it or not. At least this way, it stays in the family." "That's some twisted logic, even for you." Tony had known me long enough to call me on my bullshit, which was both annoying and necessary. He'd been there through the early days of the restaurant, when I was working 18-hour days and surviving on 3 hours of sleep and pure stubbornness. He'd also been there during the darker periods, when the weight of family rejection had nearly broken me. "You remember what Linda said at your wedding?" I asked. Tony's expression darkened. "Marcus, she asked Maria why she'd invited the help to sit at the family. She literally called me the help at your wedding, and you've been carrying that around for what, 8 years? That's not healthy, man." It wasn't just one comment, it was a lifetime of comments, a lifetime of being made to feel like I didn't belong anywhere near them. I turned to face him fully. "You know what the worst part is?" I kept trying. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering, I showed up hoping things would be different. I kept thinking that if I just achieved enough, earned enough, proved myself enough, they'd finally accept me. "So when did you realize they never would?" The question hit deeper than I expected. When had I realized it was hopeless? Was it the graduation speech where Linda managed to make even my valedictorian achievement sound like a consolation prize? The James Beard nomination she dismissed as meaningless? Or was it something smaller, more subtle? Maybe it was the Christmas 3 years ago when she'd given everyone personalized ornaments with their names engraved, except mine just said guest. "I think I always knew," I said finally. "I just didn't want to admit it." Tony nodded and took another spoonful of soup. "So what's the end game here? You've got their house, you've humiliated them publicly. What happens next?" "I haven't decided yet." "Bullshit. You've been planning this for months. You don't make moves like this without knowing exactly where they lead." He was right, of course. I'd been thinking about the end game since the day I'd signed the deed. The question was whether I was ready to admit it, even to myself. "I want them to feel what I felt," I said. "I want them to know what it's like to be powerless, to have your security ripped away by people who are supposed to care about you." "And then what? You think that's going to fix the relationship?" "There is no relationship to fix," I said. "There never was. Linda made sure of that." Tony finished his soup and pushed the bowl away. "You know what your problem is, Marcus? You're so busy proving that they were wrong about you, that you're becoming exactly the kind of person they said you were." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Bitter. Vindictive. The kind of guy who burns bridges just to watch them fall." He stood and put on his coat. "I've got to get back. Storm's supposed to get worse this afternoon." After he left, I found myself alone with his words echoing through the empty restaurant. Was he right? Had I become the villain in this story? Or was I finally just refusing to be the victim? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Jake. We need to talk. Can you meet me somewhere neutral?" I stared at the message for a long time. Jake had always been the most level-headed person in the family, the one who tried to stay out of the drama while still being supportive. If he wanted to talk, it probably meant the situation was worse than I'd imagined. I texted back, "Coffee shop on 5th and Madison, 1 hour." The storm had intensified by the time I reached the coffee shop, fat snowflakes swirling in the wind like nature's way of matching my mood. Jake was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. He looked like he'd aged 5 years since yesterday. "Thanks for coming," he said as I slid into the opposite seat. "How's Emma?" "Not good. She's been crying since you left. Blames herself for not speaking up more over the years." He paused. "She's also worried about you." "Worried about me? I'm not the one who just lost my house." "No, you're the one who just declared war on your own family." "That's not exactly a victory, Marcus." I ordered an espresso from the waitress and leaned back in the booth. "So what's the damage assessment? How bad is it really?" Jake ran a hand through his hair. "Linda's having panic attacks. She spent most of the night throwing up from stress. David's gone completely silent, won't talk to anyone. And Emma keeps saying this is all her fault for not protecting you better." "It's not Emma's fault. I know that. You know that. But she's convinced that if she'd stood up to her mother more, things never would have gotten this bad." The espresso arrived, strong and bitter, like my mood. "What do you want from me, Jake?" "I want to understand what you're really after here. Because if it's just revenge, then you've gotten it. Linda's destroyed, David's broken, and Emma's falling apart. Mission accomplished. You think that's what this is about, just hurting them. Isn't it?" I stared out the window at the swirling snow. Do you have any idea what it's like to spend your entire adult life trying to earn love from people who've already decided you're not worth it? No, Jake said quietly. I don't. Every achievement I've had, every success, every time I thought maybe now they'd see me as an equal, Linda found a way to cut me down, and Dad just let her do it. I took a sip of espresso. You saw what happened last night. While everyone else got prime rib, I got leftovers. After 23 years, I'm still being treated like a charity case in my own family. Jake was quiet for a moment. You're right. What Linda did was cruel. What they've both done over the years was wrong. But Marcus, buying their house, that's not justice, that's destruction. Maybe that's what this situation needed. What happens to Emma in all this? She's your sister regardless of biology. She loves you and she's caught in the middle of a war she didn't start. That hit harder than I wanted to admit. Emma had always been innocent in the collateral damage of a conflict that predated her understanding of family dynamics. She'd grown up assuming the tension between her mother and me was normal sibling rivalry, not realizing how deep the dysfunction ran. I never wanted to hurt Emma, I said, but you are hurting her. Every day this continues. Every escalation, it tears her apart more. So what's your solution? I just forgive and forget, pretend like 23 years of emotional abuse never happened. I'm not asking you to forget anything. I'm asking you to think about what you actually want the outcome to be. Jake leaned forward. Do you want to repair this family, or do you want to finish destroying it? There's nothing to repair. Linda made sure of that years ago. Then why didn't you just cut them off completely? Why go through all this elaborate revenge? If they mean nothing to you, why does their opinion matter so much that you need to prove them wrong? I didn't have a good answer for that, which annoyed me more than I wanted to admit. Jake pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. Emma and Sophia building a snowman in their backyard, both of them laughing at something off camera. That's your niece Marcus. She asks about Uncle Marcus every time we visit your parents. She doesn't understand why you never come around anymore. That's not my fault. Whose fault it is doesn't matter to a 2-year-old. All she knows is that her uncle disappeared. We sat in silence for a while, watching the snow accumulate. Watching the snow accumulate on the sidewalk outside. The coffee shop was warm and busy, full of people seeking refuge from the storm. Normal people with normal families who probably didn't spend their holidays plotting elaborate revenge schemes. What do they want? I asked finally. To fix this. To find a way to move forward that doesn't involve anyone losing everything they care about. Linda doesn't care about anything except her image and her comfort. Dad cares more about keeping her happy than protecting his own son. There's nothing to fix. Jake pulled out another document and slid it across the table. Linda wrote this last night. She asked me to give it to you. I stared at the folder like it might bite me. What is it? A letter. An apology, I think. I didn't read it. I don't want her apology. Then don't read it. But she wrote it, and she asked me to make sure you got it. What you do with it is up to you. I pocketed the letter without opening it. Anything else? David wants to know if you'll sell the house back to them. They're willing to work out a payment plan, even if it takes years to pay off. With what money? Their credit is ruined. I might be able to help with financing. As a family loan, not through traditional channels. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. So now they want to negotiate. After 23 years of treating me like garbage, now they want to make deals. People change, Marcus. Sometimes it takes a crisis to make them realize how badly they've screwed up. People don't change. They just get better at hiding who they really are. I finished my espresso and stood up. Tell them I'll consider it. But any negotiation goes through my lawyer. I'm done with family meetings and emotional manipulation. This isn't manipulation. This is a family trying to survive a crisis. This is consequences. I corrected him. Something they should have considered before spending 2 decades treating me like an unwelcome guest in my own home. I left Jake sitting in the coffee shop and walked back through the storm to my restaurant. The lunch rush was over, and only a few staff members remained, prepping for the evening service that would probably be canceled due to the weather. In my office, I pulled out Linda's letter and stared at it for a long time before finally opening it. Marcus, it began in Linda's careful handwriting. I don't know where to start, or if you'll even read this, but I need to try to explain. The letter went on for 3 pages, detailing her childhood, her fears about raising Emma as a single mother, her gratitude when she'd met Dad. She wrote about feeling threatened by my relationship with him, worried that I would always come first because I was his biological son. She admitted to trying to create distance between us, thinking it would make her own position more secure. I know I was wrong, she wrote. I know I hurt you in ways that can't be undone. I let my own insecurities turn me into someone cruel, and I robbed you of the family you deserved. I robbed Emma of the brother she could have had, if I hadn't been so threatened by your existence. The letter ended with a plea for forgiveness, not for her sake but for the family's. I don't expect you to trust me again, or even to like me. But please don't let my mistakes destroy Emma's chance to have her brother in her life. She loves you more than you know, and losing you would break her heart in ways that might never heal. I read the letter 3 times, then folded it and put it in my desk drawer.
Weaver, 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 Weaver.
It was a good letter, probably sincere, definitely well written, but words were easy. Actions were what mattered, and Linda's actions had spoken clearly for 23 years. Still, something about the letter nagged at me. Maybe it was the reference to Emma, or the admission that Linda's behavior had been driven by fear rather than malice. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it provided context I'd never considered. My phone rang. Emma again. Did you read it? She asked without preamble. Jake told you he delivered it? He said you took it. Marcus, please. Mom's falling apart. She knows she screwed up, but this is killing her. Good, I said, then immediately regretted the harshness of it. That's not who you are, Emma said softly. I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but you're not cruel. Don't let her mistakes turn you into someone you're not. After I hung up, I sat in my office watching the snow fall outside the window. The city was quieting down as the storm intensified, most people choosing to stay home rather than venture out into the chaos. But chaos had a way of clarifying things, stripping away the unnecessary and revealing what really mattered. The question was, what really mattered to me? Was it proving that I was successful despite Linda's attempts to diminish me? I'd already done that. Was it making her pay for years of emotional abuse? Mission accomplished there. Was it protecting myself from further hurt by cutting off all contact? I could do that without owning their house. Or was it something else entirely, something I hadn't wanted to admit, even to myself? Maybe Tony had been right. Maybe this wasn't really about revenge. Maybe it was about finally getting their attention, making them see me as someone who mattered enough to fear. Maybe after 23 years of being invisible, I'd chosen the most dramatic way possible to force them to acknowledge my existence. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd bought their house not to destroy them, but to finally definitively make them notice me, to prove that the stepson they dismissed as a failure had more power than they'd ever imagined. It was pathetic, and effective, and completely unsustainable as a long-term strategy. I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer, Michael Brennan. We'd worked together on several real estate deals and he'd handled the house purchase with his usual efficiency. Marcus, he answered on the first ring. How did Christmas go? About as dramatically as we expected. Listen, I need to ask you something hypothetically. If someone wanted to sell a recently acquired property back to the previous owners, what would that process look like? Hypothetically, it would be straightforward. Draft a new purchase agreement, arrange financing if needed, handle the title transfer. Same as any real estate transaction. He paused. Is this about the Patterson house? Maybe. I'm still thinking about it. Can I give you some advice, both as your lawyer and as someone who's known you for 5 years? Go ahead. Revenge feels good in the moment, but it's expensive in the long run. Not financially, emotionally. You've made your point. Maybe it's time to figure out what you actually want from this situation. After I hung up, I found myself thinking about something Emma had said about Sophia asking where Uncle Marcus was. A 2-year-old who didn't understand adult grudges or family dysfunction, who just knew that someone she loved wasn't around anymore. I walked to the restaurant's front window and watched the snow continue to fall. The city looked clean and peaceful under its white blanket, like all the dirt and complications had been temporarily covered over. But I knew that come morning, when the plows had done their work and people returned to their normal routines, all the underlying problems would still be there, just temporarily hidden. That's when I realized what I actually wanted. Not revenge, not destruction, not even victory in any traditional sense. I wanted a family. A real one, where people showed up for each other instead of keeping score, where conflicts were resolved through conversation rather than financial warfare, where love wasn't conditional on meeting impossible standards or staying invisible. The question was whether it was too late to build something like that from the wreckage of what we'd been. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Dad's contact information. We hadn't spoken directly since I'd dropped the deed on the coffee table, but maybe it was time to change that. Not to apologize or capitulate, but to see if there was any foundation left to build on. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. "Marcus, hi Dad." There was a long pause. In the background, I could hear the television and what sounded like Linda crying. "I don't know what to say to you," he admitted. "You could start with the truth, about why you let her treat me the way she did." Another long pause. "Because I was a coward. Because it was easier to let her make you the problem than to deal with the real issues in our marriage." The honesty caught me off guard. I'd expected defensiveness, excuses, maybe anger. Not this quiet admission of failure. What real issues? She never felt secure, never felt like she was enough, and instead of addressing that, I let her take it out on you. I told myself you were strong enough to handle it, that you'd be fine because you had your cooking and your ambitions. His voice cracked slightly. I was wrong, about all of it. Why now? Why admit this now? Because I saw your face last night when she served you those leftovers. I saw 23 years of hurt in that moment, and I realized what we'd done to you, what I'd done to you. I leaned against the window, feeling the cold seep through the glass. Do you know what the worst part was? It wasn't the comments about my career or the way she treated me like an outsider. It was that you let her do it. My own father chose someone else over me, again and again. I know, and I don't know how to fix that. Maybe you can't fix it. Maybe some things are broken beyond repair. Maybe, he agreed, but maybe we could try to build something new, something better. What would that look like? I don't know yet, but it would start with me standing up to Linda when she's wrong, instead of taking the easy path. It would mean putting your well-being ahead of her comfort, the way I should have done from the beginning. And what about the house? Keep it, sell it, burn it down if you want. The house isn't what matters. What does matter? You do. My son matters more than any building, any mortgage, any amount of money. I should have figured that out 23 years ago, but I'm a slow learner apparently. We talked for another hour, covering 23 years of missed conversations and avoided truth. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, and it certainly wasn't resolution, but it was a beginning, a tentative first step towards something that might eventually resemble a real relationship between father and son. When I finally hung up, the snow had stopped falling, and the city was beginning to dig itself out from under the storm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations, and the long work of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by years of neglect and resentment. But for the first time in months, I felt something other than anger when I thought about my family. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't trust. It was something more fragile but potentially more valuable: hope. 2 weeks passed before I called the family meeting. 2 weeks of sleepless nights, heated phone calls with Emma, and long conversations with my therapist about what healing actually looked like. Dr. Martinez had been brutally honest about my motivations, pointing out that buying the house had been less about justice and more about finally getting the attention I'd craved my entire life. The truth stung, but it also clarified what I needed to do next. I chose neutral ground, a conference room at Jake's accounting firm on a Sunday afternoon, when the building would be empty. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This wasn't a family dinner where old dynamics could take hold. This was a business meeting, where we'd either find a path forward or formalize the end of our relationship. Linda arrived first, looking like she'd aged a decade in 2 weeks. Her usual perfect makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she poured herself coffee from the pot Jake had prepared. She wore a simple black dress instead of her usual designer outfit, and her hair was pulled back in a basic ponytail rather than styled. It was the first time I'd ever seen her looking vulnerable instead of polished. Dad came in 5 minutes later with Emma and Jake. He looked directly at me for the first time in weeks, his expression unreadable. Emma had been crying again, her eyes red and puffy, but she managed a weak smile when she saw me. I'd prepared remarks, bullet points on a legal pad about boundaries and expectations, but seeing them all gathered together made the formal approach seem inadequate. These weren't adversaries in a business negotiation, they were broken people trying to figure out how to be a family. "Thank you for coming," I said, taking my seat at the head. The power position, though I wasn't sure I wanted it anymore. Linda spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "I read your conditions through Jake. The therapy requirement, the written agreements about respect and inclusion. I want you to know I'll do whatever it takes. This isn't about making you jump through hoops," I said. "It's about making sure we don't end up here again in 5 years. I know." She looked down at her hands. "I've already started seeing someone. Dr. Chen in town. She specializes in family dynamics and childhood trauma." The childhood trauma reference caught me off guard. Linda had never talked about her past beyond vague references to growing up poor, but maybe that's where her need to control and exclude had originated. Maybe understanding the why wouldn't excuse the behavior, but it might help prevent it from continuing. Dad cleared his throat. "I want to say something before we get into the logistics. Marcus, I failed you as a father, not just by allowing Linda to treat you poorly, but by not seeing how much damage was being done. I was so focused on keeping peace that I forgot my primary job was protecting my son." The apology hit harder than I expected. I'd imagined this moment for years, but the reality was messier than my fantasies. There was no surge of vindication, no sense of finally being vindicated, just sadness for all the years we'd lost to dysfunction and avoidance. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "But words are easy, actions are what matter going forward." Emma leaned forward. "What would those actions look like, specifically?" I pulled out the document I'd spent hours crafting with my lawyer and family therapy. All of us together for at least 6 months. Individual therapy for Linda and Dad to work on their own issues. Written agreements about how family gatherings will work, including equal treatment and shared decision-making. "In the house?" Jake asked. "I'll sell it back to you at cost. No profit, no interest, just what I paid plus legal fees." I looked directly at Linda. "But there are conditions. The deed includes a clause that if the agreed-upon family standards aren't maintained, I have the right to buy it back at any time." Linda's eyes widened. "You're keeping leverage." "I'm protecting myself from going through this again. Trust has to be earned." "Linda, you spent 23 years teaching me not to trust you. It's going to take time to undo that damage." Dad nodded slowly. "That seems fair. More than fair considering." "There's something else," I said, looking at Emma. "I want to be in Sophia's life. Really in it, not just showing up for birthdays and Christmas. I want to be the uncle she deserves, which means regular visits, involvement in important decisions, being someone she can count on." Emma's face lit up for the first time in weeks. "She asks about you constantly. She's been drawing pictures of Uncle Marcus and leaving them by the front door." The image hit me like a physical blow. A 2-year-old who didn't understand adult grudges, just missing someone she loved. Maybe that's what family really was supposed to be. Showing up consistently, being reliable, caring more about the relationship than about being right. Linda reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. I wrote something else, not a letter this time, but a timeline. Every incident I could remember where I treated you unfairly, going back to when you were 12, with explanations, not excuses, just trying to understand my own behavior. I took the envelope but didn't open it. Why? Because I need to own what I did completely. Not just the big moments but all the small cruelties, all the ways I made you feel unwelcome in your own home. If we're going to rebuild this, I need to acknowledge exactly how much damage was done. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, covering logistics and expectations, boundaries and consequences. Jake took notes, turning our family dysfunction into actionable items and measurable goals. It felt strange to approach love like a business plan, but maybe that's what we needed. Clear parameters when emotions had proven unreliable. As we prepared to leave, Linda approached me hesitantly. "Marcus, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know something. When I met your father, I was terrified of being abandoned again. My first husband left when Emma was 6 months old. I thought if I could make myself indispensable, make our life together perfect enough, David would never leave me. So you made me the threat to eliminate. I made you the scapegoat for my own insecurity. I convinced myself that if you and David got too close, I'd lose him. So I did everything I could to keep you at a distance. Her voice broke slightly. I destroyed a child's sense of belonging because I was afraid of being alone. That's unforgivable, but I need you to know it was never about you not being worthy of love. It was about my own brokenness. For the first time in 23 years, Linda's explanation made sense. Not acceptable sense, not forgivable sense, but human sense. She'd been a wounded person who'd wounded others, and maybe understanding that was the first step towards something healthier. The family therapy sessions started the following week. Dr. Williams was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, who specialized in blended family dynamics and intergenerational trauma. She had a way of cutting through emotional manipulation and getting to the core issues that was both uncomfortable and necessary. In our third session, she asked Linda to explain what she'd been trying to achieve with her treatment of me over the years. Linda's answer was revealing. She'd been trying to make me choose to leave voluntarily, thinking that would be less threatening than a direct confrontation with Dad about his divided loyalties. So instead of addressing your marital insecurity with your husband, you tried to drive out a child who had done nothing wrong, Dr. Williams said bluntly. Yes, Linda whispered, and it almost worked. He started pulling away, spending more time at work, avoiding family gatherings. I thought I was protecting my marriage, but I was actually destroying the man I'd fallen in love with. Dad spoke up for the first time that session. You weren't protecting anything. You were teaching me that love was conditional, that family was a zero-sum game where someone always had to lose. The breakthrough came in session 5, when Dr. Williams asked me what I'd really wanted from my family all these years. The answer surprised even me. I wanted to matter, I said. Not to be the most important, not to be favored, just to matter enough that my feelings would be considered before decisions were made. And when that didn't happen, I stopped believing I was worthy of mattering to anyone. Linda was crying openly by then, but Dr. Williams didn't let her interrupt with apologies or self-flagellation. Instead, she turned to Dad. David, what did you learn from watching your wife systematically exclude your son? That I'm capable of cowardice I never imagined, that I prioritized my own comfort over my child's well-being, that I failed at the most basic responsibility of parenthood, which was making sure my child felt safe and loved in his own home. The work was exhausting and painful, but it was also productive. Linda started recognizing her patterns of behavior and developing healthier coping mechanisms for her insecurity. Dad began standing up to her when she slipped into old habits, something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Emma and I started having weekly dinners, just the two of us, rebuilding the sibling relationship that had been strained by years of her being caught in the middle. She told me stories about growing up with the constant tension, never understanding why family gatherings felt like minefields. I thought it was normal, she admitted over pasta at my restaurant. I thought every family had one person who was always on the outside, always walking on eggshells. It's not your fault you didn't know better, I said. You were a kid too, but I should have stood up for you more as an adult. I should have called Mom out when she made those comments about your career or excluded you from family decisions. You're standing up now, that's what matters. The house sale went through in March, 6 weeks after our first family meeting. I signed the deed over to Dad and Linda at cost, though I kept the buyback clause as insurance against future dysfunction. The symbolism was important for all of us. They got their home back, but the power dynamics had fundamentally shifted. The first post-therapy family gathering was Easter dinner. Linda had insisted on cooking, but this time she asked what I'd like rather than assuming I'd be grateful for whatever was left. The meal was awkward at first, all of us hyper-aware of our words and actions, but gradually conversation began flowing more naturally. Dad asked about my restaurant expansion plans, genuinely interested rather than dismissive. Linda complimented the wine I'd brought, then asked about the vineyard it came from. Emma talked about Sophia's latest achievements, but also asked about my own goals and challenges. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still old patterns trying to reassert themselves. But for the first time in over 2 decades, I felt like I was sitting at a family table, rather than being tolerated as a guest. The real test came 6 months later when Linda's sister visited from Ohio. Aunt Patricia had always been Linda's reinforcement in the campaign to keep me marginalized, the voice that whispered that stepchildren never really belonged. Within an hour of her arrival, She'd made 3 separate comments about how lucky Linda was, that I'd turned out okay, despite not being really family. The old Linda would have smiled and agreed. The new Linda looked her sister in the eye, and said, "Marcus is absolutely real family. He's David's son, which makes him my son, and I won't tolerate anyone suggesting otherwise in my home." The moment felt like a graduation of sorts, not from the therapy or the rebuilding process, but from the old version of our family that had been built on exclusion and conditional love. That night, after Patricia had retreated to her hotel in wounded silence, Linda found me on the back porch where I was helping Sophia catch fireflies. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For giving us a chance." "See, for what? For giving us a chance to be better. For not walking away completely when you had every right to." I watched Sophia chase a particularly bright firefly across the lawn, her laughter mixing with the sound of crickets and distant traffic. "I didn't do it for you," I said. "I did it for her, and for Emma, and maybe for the dad I remembered from before you came along, and for yourself." I considered the question. "I did it because I realized that destroying you wouldn't fill the hole that not having a real family had left. Only building something better could do that." Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I took from you." "Don't do that either," I said. "Don't make your guilt the center of our relationship. Just be better going forward. That's all any of us can do." The conversation was interrupted by Sophia running over with a mason jar containing 2 fire.
"See? Look, Uncle Marcus. I caught them for you."
"They're beautiful, sweetheart, but you know what? I think they'd be happier if we let them go home to their families." She considered this seriously, then nodded and unscrewed the lid. We watched the fireflies spiral up into the darkness, their lights blinking like tiny beacons against the night sky. Later, as I drove home through the quiet suburbs, I thought about the strange turns life could take. A year ago I'd been planning elaborate revenge against people I thought had ruined my childhood. Tonight I'd spent the evening catching fireflies with my niece while her grandmother apologized for decades of mistakes. Neither version of the story was what I'd expected, but one had left me feeling empty while the other had filled spaces in my heart I'd forgotten existed. The therapy continued for another 6 months, then transitioned to monthly check-ins. The written agreements became unnecessary as new habits took hold. Dad started calling me weekly just to talk. Linda began asking for my advice on restaurant recommendations for her clients. Emma and I became genuinely close for the first time since we were children. But the most significant change was in how I saw myself. For 33 years I'd carried the belief that there was something fundamentally unlovable about me, something that made me unworthy of family loyalty. The revenge fantasy had been built on proving that belief wrong through success and power. The reality was simpler and more profound. I'd always been worthy of love. The problem had never been my inadequacy, but others' inability to see past their own wounds and fears. Standing in my restaurant kitchen on a busy Friday night, watching my team work together like a well-choreographed dance, I realized I'd built the family I'd always wanted. People who showed up for each other, who celebrated successes and supported each other through failures, who chose to be together rather than being obligated by blood. The biological family was healing, slowly and imperfectly, but the chosen family I'd created through years of patience and mutual respect had taught me what love was supposed to look like. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Sophia's ballet recital is next Saturday at 2. She specifically requested that Uncle Marcus sit in the front row. Also, Mom is making her famous tiramisu afterward, and asked if you could bring that wine you shared at Easter." I smiled and typed back, "Wouldn't miss it for the world." Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy, millions of people navigating their own complicated relationships and family dynamics. Some of them would choose revenge when they were hurt, others would choose withdrawal. A few, maybe, would choose the harder path of rebuilding something better from the wreckage of what came before. I'd tried revenge, and it had tasted like ash. I'd tried withdrawal, and it had felt like suffocation. But choosing to rebuild, choosing to believe that people could change and relationships could heal, that had tasted like freedom. As I locked up the restaurant and headed home to my penthouse apartment, I thought about the Christmas dinner that had started everything. The leftovers, the humiliation, the moment I'd decided I'd had enough. That night had felt like an ending, the final proof that I'd never be accepted. Instead, it had been the beginning of something I'd never imagined that actually worked. Not perfect, not without conflict, but built on respect and genuine care rather than obligation and resentment. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, sometimes it's transformation. Sometimes it's proving that the people who hurt you were wrong, not about your worth, but about the impossibility of change. The fireflies were still blinking in suburban backyards across the city, tiny lights refusing to be extinguished by the darkness, just like hope. Just like the possibility that tomorrow could be better than yesterday, if you're brave enough to believe it, and patient enough to do the work. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.